So I'm going to start off the talk and then I'll pass it over to Maud, and then I'll also finish it off with some next steps. So white-tailed deer are invading into the western boreal forests of Alberta, and an example of where we've seen this expansion is right here in Fort McMurray region of northeastern Alberta, where we saw an increase in white-tailed deer abundance from the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s. And during the same time period, there was an observed increase in the prevalence of white-tailed deer in the scat of wolves, a primary predator or dominant predator on that landscape. Concurrently, there was a decline in the prevalence of moose within wolf scat, indicating a switch from moose to deer, despite fairly stable moose populations during the same time period. Now, this increase in white-tailed deer populations has some important implications to the boreal food web. Primarily, an increase in white-tailed deer densities is related to an increase in the abundance or density of predators on that landscape, including species like wolves and black bears, which incidentally prey on woodland caribou, creating apparent competition between white-tailed deer and caribou. And one of the leading causes or hypothesized causes of this increase in white-tailed deer populations in these boreal forests of northern Alberta is through the creation of early cereal forests when we cut forests down and create new growth in its place, things like forestry or oil and gas exploration. But the degree in which we can expect an increase in deer abundance following this change on the landscape from human habitat alteration is unknown. Here's where I'd start to talk about some of the work that Jake and Cole have done to investigate this, but I will let them talk about that themselves and skip over that and just highlight that one of the unknowns is because these habitat alterations in the boreal forests of northern Alberta really only directly influences about 10% of the landscape. There might be some edge effects going on, but the direct effect of human habitat alteration is fairly low. So how much can we actually expect that to increase the abundance of deer rather than just changes in distribution? If we look at what that habitat alteration looks like across the province, we can see that human habitat alteration or footprint is quite heavy in the southern portions of the province, and then as we move northward, there's a decline in the amount of human habitat alteration. And at the same time, there's also a change in climate as we move northward. So there's this confound between human habitat alteration and metrics of climate. Here I'm showing you temperature, where as we move from the south to the north of the province, human habitat alteration is declining, but winter severity is increasing. And we know that climate can also have a large impact on white-tailed deer populations. Work from Daw and Booten showed that the probability of deer being present at a site declines as that site has a more severe winter severity index. And that line where we expect to see deer being present has been moving northward over time across the province. In the 60s, we were down below Fort McMurray, and the 90s well above Fort McMurray, and it's continuing to move northwards. So the objective of our work at the CMU has largely been focused on disentangling the effect of human habitat alteration and climate on white-tailed deer densities, recognizing that there's this confound between habitat alteration and climate across space as well as across time. Sorry, my screen's not advancing now. There we go. And this has some important implications for how we manage deer And then, of course, that means there's implications to how we manage caribou populations. As well, the relative influence of habitat alteration and climate are one of the biggest unknowns facing applied ecologists today. And there are implications for understanding how the abundance and distribution of species are changing and being influenced in very quickly changing landscapes. So now with that introduction, I'm going to pass it off to my co-presenter Maud to talk about our paper where we took a first stab at this.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. So as Melanie explained, the purpose of this research was to try to evaluate the relative effects of climate versus habitat alteration from human activities on deer to help anticipate potential effects of growing alteration of the landscape and climate change. So what we did is we used data from more than 700 camera trap sites that were deployed across Alberta. So on these maps, each dot is a site with 4 cameras. And at each of these camera sites, we extracted from the cameras a monthly density estimate of white-tailed deer, which was calculated with the time deer spent in front of the camera, as well as if deer were present or absent from the site each month. We also extracted at each of these sites the depth of the snow on the ground during each winter month from November to March, and a habitat alteration percentage, which is how much of the ground around the cameras is altered, which can be just, for example, if the cameras are on a cut line in the forest or on a road. So the goal of the project was to look at the relative effects of this snow depth value as an indicator of climate and this habitat alteration on the presence and density of deer. So as Melanie explained, there is a confounding effect of latitude. You can see on the left map that the average snow depth at a given time increases as you go north. And on the right map, the habitat alteration percentage decreases as you go north. So to take this into account in our analysis, we split the province in half and added this latitude group, south or north, as a factor. We also separated our analysis into 2 seasons. So we looked at the effect of snow on deer in winter, and we also looked at the effect of winter snow on deer in the following spring, because there may be a lag effect or a long-term effect of the winter snow on the distribution of deer. You can change that. Thank you. In terms of analysis, we wanted to know first which variables should be included in the models. So we compared the AICs of different models. The null model was looking at the effect of the latitude group only, and the models increased in complexity to include snow depth, habitat alteration, as well as their interaction with latitude group. Now, the comparison of AICs told us that the best model to explain the presence of deer was the most complex one, with both factors interacting with latitude for both winter and spring season. However, the best model to explain the density of deer in winter only included the snow depth, but in spring, it was again the most complex one. Thank you. Okay, so these graphs present the probability of presence of deer on the y-axis with the habitat alteration on the x-axis. And we can see that in winter, the probability of presence increases as habitat alteration increases. This means the more there's habitat alteration, the more likely it is that deer will be present at the site. And we have the same result in spring. Interestingly, this effect is only significant in the north. In the south, habitat alteration did not affect deer presence. And it's possible that the south of the province already reached such a high level of alteration that increasing it wouldn't impact deer presence anymore. Thank you. Now, these graphs present the probability of presence of deer in function of snow depth on the x-axis, and the opposite. The deeper the snow, the less likely it is to have presence of deer. Now, what's interesting is that this is also the case in spring. This is also the case in spring, which means there is a lag effect. The snow that falls in winter has an effect on the deer distribution in the following spring. We also looked at the effect of these two factors on the density of deer, so the numbers of deer at the camera sites. And the results show that winter density was only impacted by the snow depth and only in the south part of the province. And in spring, only the habitat alteration influenced deer density. So the number of deer in spring wasn't impacted by the previous winter snow depth. Now, with these model results, we wanted to know which may have driven more deer expansion in the last decades, snow depth or habitat alteration. So we looked at published data, and what we found was that habitat alteration increased by about 4% from 1999 to 2016, according to an ABMI paper. And according to a study by Vincent et al., the snow depth has decreased by about 10% on average during this time. Now, when we apply our models using these values, it seems that the presence of deer was more sensitive to a 4% increase in habitat alteration than a 10% decrease in snow depth in both spring and winter, except when habitat alteration did not impact presence in the south in winter. On the density, the result told us that a 10% decrease in snow would impact more deer density in winter than would a 4% increase in habitat alteration in spring. So all of these results are interesting, but we can see that they're all still conditional on the latitude group and the season. So in terms of discussion, these results told us that both habitat alteration and snow depth play a significant role in white-tailed deer distribution and abundance in Alberta. And the differences we found between the south and the north tell us that restoring altered habitats may slow deer expansion, particularly in the north of the province, where the effort for restoration is lower. But with all of this, it's important to keep in mind that habitat alteration is a modifiable factor. We can try to restore habitat, we can try to slow down human expansion, but we cannot change the climate. So that was a quick overview of our research, and now we'll hear from Melanie's more recent research on the subject.
Thanks so much, Maud. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump right in here. So the next step that we wanted to take to really kind of drive this research in another approach completely, but tackling a similar question to see if we get similar types of results, is by comparing high human habitat alteration landscape in Alberta to a neighboring one in Saskatchewan, where human habitat alteration is significantly lower. So here we can see the study area map, where on the Saskatchewan side, you can see the dark shading, which is the human habitat disturbance buffered by 500 meters as per the federal recovery strategy for boreal woodland caribou, is about 3.6 times less than what we see on the Alberta side. So it really does kind of drop off. And we leveraged this contrast in human habitat alteration with otherwise very similar landscapes to try and drive this question home. And in each of these black rectangles that you see, we have 25 randomly placed cameras to monitor the density of white-tailed deer. In each of these rectangular grids, which are 12.5 kilometers by 4 kilometers squared, or sorry, 12.5 kilometers by 4 kilometers, we randomly placed 25 cameras on trees which allowed us to use the time in front of camera method to estimate the density of deer at each camera and then average up to each cluster or grid. We've been collecting these data since 2017. We now have 4 years of data in hand, and we're about to have our 5th year of data in hand. So I'll show you some preliminary results. All of this is preliminary, please keep that in mind. Here I have the density of deer on the y-axis plotted against the % human habitat alteration surrounding that camera grid. And we see what we expect to see based on our biological expectation that human habitat alteration increases deer density, where the kind of Saskatchewan side at that 0 to 5% altered has far lower densities of deer compared to the 12.5+% altered on the Alberta side. But we also used metrics of climate. So we broke down a whole bunch of different metrics of climate and used a PCA to generate a climate axis here on the x-axis, which essentially can be thought of as increasing long, cold, snowy winters. So here on the y-axis, we have, again, the density of deer, and we see the density of deer declines as we get longer, colder, snowier winters, with the exception of a couple grids in the middle that are higher than you would expect based on just that kind of climate axis. And we also wanted to take into account or consider the effect of habitat productivity, because we have a substantial body of work that really makes it very obvious that we need to be considering the baseline habitat productivity of a general landscape to understand the relative effects of these features. So here in this plot, again, deer density on the y-axis. On the x-axis, I have our metric of habitat productivity, which was calculated using delta EVI. So essentially the change in the enhanced vegetation index as we moved from winter to summer, which really is a metric of increased deciduousness. And we see that areas that have higher habitat productivity or increased deciduousness have increased deer densities. So in a preliminary analysis, we looked at the support for climate versus habitat alteration, accounting for habitat productivity using an AIC model selection framework. So you'll notice that all of the models have delta EVI in them. And then we're contrasting the support for human habitat alteration versus climate. And then we also use habitat productivity interacting with each of these variables. And if we take a look at the preliminary results, we see higher support for the additive effect of climate to habitat productivity. Runner-up is the interaction between habitat productivity and human habitat alteration. So to me, this is more supporting the effect of climate, but unsurprisingly, direct habitat alteration is not to be ignored. If we plot out these modeled effects of the top climate and habitat productivity model, we see that the predicted relationship, the line on this figure, matches pretty closely with the observed data, with the exception of these two observations that I pointed out earlier. And we see now, aha, these are the sites with the highest habitat productivity. So the density of deer at these sites is higher than we would expect based on climate only. And this really points to delta EVI or high habitat productivity at those sites being, the reason why. If we look at that same data, same prediction, but now we have habitat productivity on the x-axis instead of climate, we see again that the data fits the predicted relationship pretty well, with the exception of these few sites down here that have lower densities of deer than what we would expect based on habitat productivity. And again, if we look at the climate metric in the coloring, we see that these sites have longer, colder, snowier winters. So these are the harsh winter sites that are driving deer densities down based on what you would expect from habitat productivity alone. So what does all of this mean? What are the management implications for woodland caribou? For caribou conservation, we really have 4 main levers that we can pull. The first being habitat restoration and protection. If we go a little bit closer, we can actually reduce prey species directly by increased hunter harvest of species like white-tailed deer. Even more closely to caribou themselves, we can directly reduce predators to reduce that mortality risk. And the closest one to caribou is, of course, demographic augmentation of caribou themselves. If we were to focus on human habitat alteration, we would need to consider that climate is also going to be affecting the relationships that we're seeing, which really brings us to the idea that we need to consider multiple management levers at once. So for example, if climate is going to keep deer around for the long term, we might need to consider prey management or predator management in the long term. Whereas if climate isn't that important relative to habitat alteration, then we can really rely on habitat restoration to bring those white-tailed deer densities down. This isn't to say that one is more important than the other necessarily, but to remind us that we need to be considering the effect of climate as we move forward with other management options like habitat restoration. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our funders. There are many, as well as the field crew, particularly Natasha Crossland, who has been managing a lot of the camera program, and many amazing field technicians, and we welcome questions.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much. I guess I'm going to be doing most of the presenting, and Cole can jump in on questions or correct me if I say something out of turn. We're going to be talking today about work we've been doing over the last 10 years, trying to understand white-tailed deer distributions and density and behavior, and how that relates to landscape change. It involves a whole cast of characters. Started at Initech, Alberta, and Cole and I worked for them. Now we've moved on, and it was being finally delivered out of the UVic, ARCKP, and UBC Wildco labs, and involves a whole pile of people. And of course, the reason we're all here is the fact that white-tailed deer are creeping their way into the boreal forest, and have done so, as Mel pointed out, for the last couple of decades. And this is especially problematic for reasons that Mel said for woodland caribou, because wolves take woodland caribou. They also take deer. The more deer you have, the more wolves you have, the less caribou you have. These ramifications spread throughout the entire community, including other predators like black bears, and some current work we're doing is showing actually affects a whole suite of other things as well. So big questions here. Why are white-tailed deer in the boreal, and what can we do about it? And so there's the climate angle. Our focus includes the climate angle a little bit, but focuses much more on the habitat alteration piece. Now, white-tailed deer expansion is not an Alberta or Saskatchewan phenomenon. It is a continental phenomenon. Here's current white-tailed deer range, and it's really important that we put this in the right context and have the right spatio-temporal time frame. Since the end of the Pleistocene, white-tailed deer have been moving up from the Carolinas and moving their way north. So this isn't just an Alberta problem. In fact, they pushed their way now into the Yukon and NWT as well. And this has been happening for a long time before climate started to change. And it really kicked into high gear once Europeans arrived and started to modify landscapes across North America, which I think is reasonably good evidence that habitat alteration probably has a pretty significant role in here. And as Mel said, it's pretty hard to tease those two apart. Let's start here from base principles. So white-tailed deer are what's called an income breeder, meaning they live paycheck to paycheck. If they have enough food, as in the lower right-hand corner here, they take in enough energy in the span of that year with a little bit of capital from last year to make it through a hard winter. And so if there's more energy in than energy out, they survive, and then they have young, and then that whole cycle repeats itself. So the amount of energy going in is absolutely vital in this equation. Energy out, obviously important, but even if there was tropical tomorrow, it's unlikely that if the deer didn't have enough food to eat, they wouldn't be living in these environments. So let's start asking the question, what is the role of habitat alteration here? And instead of asking from one specific spatial scale, we decided to tackle it at multiple different spatial scales across that ecological hierarchy, starting from really small scales like single individual deer or a little bit of few deer that exist at the forest stand scale, several deer or a population that exists in a local landscape, in which we have to talk about things like forest matrix, and then expanding beyond that into multiple groups, not species, but just groups at the regional scale, which is a collection of different kinds of landscapes. And so that's what the last 10 years of our research has done. Let's hit this a whole bunch of different ways, see if we get some converging answers or not, and if we can find some consistencies that will give us some confidence in what we're finding. So let's start right here at the bottom of that ecological hierarchy and talk about what individual deer do. So to get at this question, when we started out 10 years ago, this project, which was a partnership with Alberta Environment and Parks, we had 40 satellite collared white-tailed deer females in and around the Christina Lake landscape, which you'll probably recognize here in and around Conklin. The Christina Lake caribou herd had been going down pretty hard, and there was lots of development in here. It was thought that there was some increasing deer populations. Government wanted us to know. So we put collars on deer, followed them around for a few years. Yeah, this map here shows some of the degree of development, different kinds of development. Linear features are the lines, obviously, with cut blocks to the north of the polygons. And we tracked deer resource selection in different seasons. So in and around parturition, when they're giving birth, the rut, when they're finding mates, in the summer, when they're gobbling up all the food they possibly can to get that income for the year, and in the winter, when they're shedding pounds like crazy because times are hard for them. And we asked, what is the relative influence of natural landscape features and anthropogenic landscape features in white-tailed deer habitat selection? And we found some pretty clear signals. So these graphs, you read them, this is proximity to the nearest feature. So if the line is declining, it means that you get more deer, we are closer to that feature. So in figure A, you can see you get a lot more deer as you get closer to cut blocks, a lot more deer as you get closer to roads, where the deer is more likely to occur there, and select that, that piece. And you have avoidance of 3D seismic lines. The relationship with wolf, interestingly, gets to the point Mel was talking about, is all over the map. And the relationship to bears is, in fact, you start to see the clustering of bears and white-tailed deer in some seasons, especially as bears cue in on the young, which is what they take. So what we found is that deer are selecting hard for cut blocks, roads, and trails, all of those things that provide early cereal vegetation. White-tailed deer cannot eat and survive on conifer. They have to have broadleaf, which is the influence of deciduousness. But even broadleaf trees, as they grow and they age, they start to deposit a lot more lignin in the leaves on an annual basis. They become less and less palatable. Of course, the leaves get higher and higher too, right? So it's that early cereal vegetation that provides a massive nutritional hit to deer. So anything that provides early cereal is good news for deer, with the exception of things like 3D seismic lines and pipelines, which is kind of interesting. There's exceptions to every rule. And we found that at the individual level anyway, deer are kind of variable with seismic lines. Some of them were really into seismic lines and some of them weren't. And these patterns are fairly consistent, at least the relationships with landscape are fairly consistent across seasons. And they start to vary in the relationship with predators, which I think again suggests this probably isn't a predator-limited population. So that's the individual deer piece, and we're still working that up to understand some of the mechanics of that relationship. But let's switch gears now and move up that hierarchy a little bit into landscapes and talk about how groups of deer or a landscape worth of deer uses the forest matrix. Let's talk about reproduction, because as an income breeder, reproduction is key for deer. And as Mel pointed out, deer, they might only use something like 10% of the landscape, but I'd argue that's true for most species. Very few species use 100% of a landscape. And if 90% of the activity is concentrated in 10% of the landscape, that 10% becomes really vital to maintaining populations in that area. So let's talk about where deer are reproducing, right? Because that's the problem here. They're cranking out kids like crazy. So to answer this, we deployed 60 cameras across the Christina Lake area, that same area where we had deer collared. We ran them for a few years. Deer, fawns, stay pretty close at heel, and so we're able to measure the probability that if we had a deer in front of the camera, what is the probability that deer had a fawn or not, and relate that to those same aspects of the landscape. And what we found is some pretty encouraging convergent information with the telemetry data. Interestingly here, seismic lines are very important. So as the percentage area of seismic lines increases, the probability of fawns increases. As 3D seismic increases in that landscape, the probability of fawns increase. Deciduousness is also important, and pipelines, kind of. So here, what we're seeing is that fawns increase with seismic lines, increase with pipelines, increase with 3D seismic lines. So here's another piece of information. We're getting a lot more kids where you get that early cereal vegetation. So let's talk about more broadly the use of deer use of that landscape. So based on those 60 cameras, we ran those cameras for 3 years, and we were really lucky because we ran them across 3 very different years of winters. The first year of the study, the first winter, was actually reasonably mild. So that dashed line is snow on ground. 30 centimeters is the 30-year running average for snow on ground. So you can see the first year was pretty nice and mild, pretty deer friendly. That second year, 2013, was winter from hell, and it was a ton of snow on the ground. It was bitterly cold, really bad conditions. And then the one that followed it up wasn't really that much better. So here we got some couple of, we'll call them historical winters, and then one moderate kind of contemporary winter. And so we used those cameras, and we used spatial mark resite models, or rather Cole did all the heavy lifting on this, and said, what does deer density do across this landscape in response to those 3 years? So these are summer density estimates over the 3 years of the study. So there's the mild winter in 2012. You can see deer densities are pretty high in there, 0.4 deer per kilometer squared. That severe winter, they took a big hit and they dropped right down the summer following that severe winter. And then there was that hard winter following, and again, deer stayed down pretty clearly. A nice tight confidence interval. So definitively, the severity of the winter is having an effect, but the problem here is that there's still lots of deer in that landscape. So climate took its hit, but there was still enough food to maintain them in that landscape. At density sitting at 0.2, 0.2.5 deer per square kilometer, which is a lot of deer. So let's talk about distribution now. So this isn't just density, this is how widespread deer are. Because if we're talking about the problem of deer feeding wolves, density matter, but if wolves aren't limited by the density of deer, maybe it doesn't matter to them if there's 0.4, 0.2, or 0.1 deer per square kilometer. It just matters, can they get a deer reliably across that landscape, you know, in large enough numbers to feed them. So the way to think about this graph is that that dashed line in the middle is a spatial expansion parameter. So if that stays constant, then the distribution across that whole casino landscape, those 60 cameras, remains constant. The black line is the probability of occupancy through time. So you can see we started here in October 2011. Occupancy was about 100%. Deer at all the cameras, dropped a little bit in the winter, then came back up for the good times of the following year. That distribution dropped considerably in that severe winter. So that tells us, okay, distribution and abundance are linked, exactly as a ton of other studies suggest they are. And distribution does go down, so it contracts. But then that black line pops back up to 1 again, stays high, drops, and then pops back up again. The green line is the spatial expansion parameter, so the probability of a site, if it's empty, becoming recolonized again. So basically the degree to which that distribution is expanding. So you can see massive expansion in the summers of 2013 and 2014 after those severe winters. So sure, winters take a hit, and those deer, they pop back into that landscape all over the place again. Why? Because they're having a ton of kids. They're having a ton of kids in those places where life is really good for them. What are the factors that predict that distribution? Just like before, there's a positive relationship with the percentage of cut blocks in the landscape. Deciduousness is really important. As Mel said, percentage of pipelines is keeping them up. Well sites kind of had a variable effect, but still a positive one. So again, it's those things that create early cereal veg in the landscape that are maintaining those distributions. This is all written up in a paper we just published in Scientific Reports. So we got some convergent information here. Let's cut this cake a whole bunch of different ways. And I can't present 10 years of research in 20 minutes, but I can direct you to the papers. And so we tackled this question with community level modeling in a bunch of different ways. We looked at the interactions between species. We looked in different landscapes. The Whitefish Lake First Nations, where we had a collaborative project with them, in which we looked at deer and a bunch of other things. That the same story all converges no matter how you cut this cake. So what does it matter regionally, right? So keep in mind that you know, deer don't use that whole landscape. They're scattered around it. Do we see these same patterns across the whole oil sands region, that northeast? And so we asked that question as well. For this, we repurposed aerial ungulate survey data from the government of Alberta. So when the government goes out doing their moose surveys, in recent years, they started to keep track of deer as well. They note the GPS coordinates of all the deer that they observed during these surveys. And this is the coverage that we got, spanning from Lloydminster, moving up into the northwest, and then some of the WMUs in the west. And so each of those blue dots you see there is a deer location. So you can see there's definitively a petering out of deer locations as you move north, in fact, northwest. Keep in mind that's also the spatial pattern of the invasion front. All these deer came from the southeast, right? The deer didn't, but their forefathers did, right? And so I think this is why it's very important to model pressure front dynamics like is done with other invasive species if we're going to try to piece apart climate versus landscape. So what we did is we used an RSF approach. So each of these yellow oblongs is a transect line with the actual flight line in the middle. The blue lines are observed individuals, blue dots. The red dots are the availables that we created to create a resource selection function, we asked, just ran an RSF on these data. Are you more likely to observe a deer from a helicopter depending on the habitat type? And so these are all the different habitat types we put into the model with the natural stuff on the top and then the anthropogenic stuff at the bottom. I'll direct your attention right down here. So if you're proximal to the nearest road, much more likely to see a deer. Proximity to seismic line, much more likely to see a deer. 3D seismic, more likely. Pipeline, more likely. Transmission line, more likely. Well sites, maybe a little dodgy. And very interestingly, here's forest harvesting sitting right on the, I don't really know if that's important or not line. So this all supports the same information we found from Whitefish, from Christina, cut a whole bunch of different ways. So, which gives us pretty good confidence that no matter how you slice it, whether it's what individual deer like, how they're distributed in the landscape, their density in the landscape, and their distribution across the OSR, habitat plays a really critical role. So what can we do about it? So starting several years ago, Cole started leading a project in the Algar region, looking at the effectiveness of seismic line restoration there. So created this really elegant, top-notch design, pretty cutting edge, looking at what's the effectiveness of different kinds of treatments. There's passive restoration here, there's active restoration, there's whether or not humans are using that landscape, the amount of lowland in the 2,000 meters surrounding the site, the amount of snow, linear density, and some other veg factors. And the key take home here for deer is this active restoration, which shows that you can significantly reduce the deer activity on a seismic line by using active restoration, which in this case was a bunch of different things, but mostly including mounding site plan prep with conifer. So that's really important, you know. So that tells us we can reduce the use of these concentrated areas by doing some active restoration. And that science on effective restoration is still emerging, and the cutting edge work that Wildco is doing has been published a bunch of different ways. Again, I think they're really clever in slicing up that cake a bunch of different ways and hitting it in different ways, saying, do we get some convergent results? And the answer is yes. So the take-home messages out of all of this work, yeah, climate's important. I think there's no question of that. But that doesn't mean that habitat alteration isn't important. And you know, Mel and I have a friendly disagreement running over this. I think habitat alteration is probably pretty critical to this scenario. Anthro features increase deer at all levels of the ecological hierarchy. You know, that's pretty damning evidence. The multiple forms of inference all converge on the same conclusions. So we're not left to the vagaries of some single way of asking this question. They're all coming into the same answer. Relationships hold across different boreal landscapes, right? So from Christina Lake to Whitefish, the work that was done in Algar, and then the whole OSR. So this isn't just a problem of Christina because it's really heavily impacted and we don't have to worry about it up north. We do have to worry about it up north. And that restoration that reduces early cereal and broadleaf vegetation is very likely required. I think Mel's absolutely right. I think that restoration alone probably isn't going to cut that mustard, not at this stage of the game, but it is a critical piece of the puzzle. And given the widespread nature of this problem, we are not doing nearly enough of it. And so with that, we can entertain questions. Here's a selection of folks at EEP and Initech who helped us out, and a whole bunch of the people who funded this research. So thanks.